So in this segment, we're going to be talking about anti-Brexiteers have possibly destroyed the Tory Party, and I am here for it. I'm absolutely here for it. This is a Brexiteer blaming, Remainers for all of the problems they're facing, despite the fact that they got rid of most of the Remainers back in 2019. So Brexit was always going to be a journey rather than an event, and so it has proved to be. But who would have thought it would have seen the end of the 4 PMs along the way after the country voted for Brexit by a majority of nearly 2 million? The problem is the Tory Party has the ERG, which is a large voting bloc, and it's not too surprising that groups like the ERG are so powerful and so dogmatic. Then again, the author is probably right because they just kept imploding the party. And I read an article recently, one that I'll cover soon, about again the ERG, Steve Baker threatening to implode the government over the Northern Ireland Protocol, with May, and they did it with May, and now they're threatening to do it again with the protocol with Sunak. David Cameron was an accidental Brexit hero in that he who called the referendum and changed the course of British history, but he knew he could not lead the country in something he did not believe in. Theresa May and her anti-Brexit Chancellor Philip Hammond made it their business to try and undermine Brexit and to keep Britain as close to the EU as possible. They nearly succeeded, and ironically it was the European elections which overturned the anti-Brexit coalition. I'm not really sure what he means by that. In Parliament, and opened the way for the appointment of PM Johnson, a Brexiteer PM harried out of office for eating Brexit cake. And the idea that, Johnson was kicked out because of Brexit is nonsense. Because the Tory Party is full of Brexiteers, so Johnson was kicked out because of his inability to deal with scandals. That's what did him in. Although Johnson failed to actively crystallise the benefits of Brexit, he, in fairness, was distracted by the coronavirus. Perhaps he was pursued because he was just about to start. I mean, it's nonsense. There were no actual benefits of Brexit, though. It was so easy to get these. If it was so easy to get these Brexit wins, they could have done it alongside with their failing to deal with the pandemic. But there was no real Brexit wins. They broke the rules around procurement, which I think breached EU rules and UK laws on open tender. And this idea that the stab in the back theory, because that's what they keep running on, by the way. This idea that Brexiteers were stabbed in the back by Remainers and the establishment and all of these people, when it makes no sense. Johnson wasn't kicked out for Brexit. He was kicked out because he consistently lied about scandals and gave ministers and MPs false information. So when they went on TV, they were giving the wrong information out, and Boris Johnson his lies kept unravelling. The Pincher scandal was that on steroids. It was just a few hours later someone gave an account, and then we found out it was wrong, and no one actually knew what the truth was around the Pincher scandals. That's how bad it was, and that was just one of the few. Let's not forget Partygate. Now we've seen Truss, who proposed a Brexit mandate, roundly attacked by the forces of the blob. It is in a revolution profoundly difficult to push forward a new agenda when the levels of power remain in the hands of the previous establishment. No doubt the growth budget was badly communicated and mishandled, but it remains the correct policy for prosperity. I mean, this is a load of nonsense. In fact, all but three of the proposals were supported by Sunak, and that's just spin. With the Starmer point, that's spin. He was against the national insurance increase, which ironically Truss voted to increase national insurance originally, and then said she was against the rise. Also, the fact is that budget could have been passed whilst we're EU members. The way they're trying to spin it is that Brexit encouraged this new British thinking of massive tax cuts. I guess you can argue Brexit is a catalyst for deregulation, which we would not be able to fully do whilst being an EU member, depending on what we were trying to do. You can argue that Brexit is helping to push a libertarian mindset, but I think it's a stretch given how many different kinds of Brexit were available to them at the time. Let's not forget the EU set the minimum standards here. So the UK being above the EU's minimum standards gave them scope to deregulate if they wanted to. They just never took it. At least never fully took it. Far from the growth proposals spooking markets. I mean, it wasn't the proposals of growth, it was the idea that unfunded tax cuts would create growth, which we know is not true. It's a nonsense point. He goes, the likelihood is that negative commentary from the anti-Brexit institutions played a great part, as did the open-ended and huge energy support package, entirely a response to the era of net zero. I mean, that's nonsense anyways. After all, the support package put forward by Sunak was unfunded, over 400 billion, and the unfunded energy package was 150 billion, dwarfing the tax package of 50 billion. So what he's trying to say here is, the tax cuts were worth around 50 billion, which is far less than the energy package and also the COVID spending. But, this guy, it was not about the borrowing. It's clear that without the energy package, the UK would be in a worse state, with energy bills hitting the 5k mark for people potentially. that will tank the economy. The cost of not having these sorts of programs would damage the economy far more than not borrowing. Borrowing to expand a business or to keep it afloat is far better than borrowing money to spend it on roulette, which Truss was trying to do. It's not hard to understand. Also, blaming these so-called anti-Brexit institutions is laughable. The Bank of England is run by a Brexiteer. Is he going to blame the IMF? Is he blaming the Remainer markets, who apparently are traders? They don't make sense. Whatever the ins and outs of the truly extraordinary events of recent weeks, the anti-Brexit cabal within the Conservative Party have wreaked grievous damage on the party, quite possibly causing it to split or disintegrate. It's not the anti-Brexit people in the Tory Party that have done this. Most of them have gone in 2019. It's the ERG who wanted a hard Brexit. They tanked May. Their libertarian utopia tanked the country, not anti-Brexit people. In doing so, the people of Britain have been caught in the crossfire and face austerity, public spending cuts, job cuts, energy poverty, high taxes, low growth, and recession. He says right now, Britain is doing relatively well by comparison with the EU, the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7, low unemployment, the avoidance of a recession, and much of the EU with higher inflation, a good basis for growth in the economy. He talks about the looming austerity is all unnecessary, which I agree with. Looming austerity is unnecessary. But then he talks about, it's the function of a refusal of the establishment to buy into Brexit, which is ironic given that Sunak is in charge now. Sunak's always been a Brexiteer, but he's going to implement austerity. So it doesn't make any sense. Austerity is a choice. It's a political choice that's normally there to shrink the state. We are being subjected to that by the choice of Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak. They don't have to do this. In terms of the debt to GDP, the UK is doing better than other G7 members, but the issue is that these countries spent a lot as well during COVID. They went above and beyond us in a lot of regards, and that spending is gone, and they can get their debt to GDP down. Of course, Russian invasion is more of a problem for some other G7 members like Germany, but the UK is the only one which has not gone back to pre-pandemic levels of trade. The UK is also suffering from a bond crisis that is subsidised by the Bank of England, but the cost of borrowing is going up due to the yields and interest rates going up. That era of low-cost borrowing is ending. So all of this kind of debt we have, it's going to go up tremendously. Obviously, the US is a bit of an oddball one because everyone assumes that the US is never going to default, and therefore they're happy to buy US bonds. And you have Japan, which is another anomaly because their debt to GDP ratio is 259%, which is wild. Italy 150%. France, which has France and Canada, which have very high borrowing, debt to GDP, but they can bring that down gradually now as these countries have recovered from the pandemic. France is in a very good position for the energy crisis because of French nuclear power plants predominantly. But the idea that the UK is in some wonderful position here is just nonsense. We're really not, especially because our debt to GDP is going to go up tremendously over the next couple of months and years as the yields go up on bonds because people don't really want to buy them, and these traders are spooked by the UK. Also, the fact that pension funds won't be able to buy as many bonds because they won't be able to use them as collateral. If the Conservatives continue to act as wreckers, the country will continue down the path of low growth and austerity, tax and spend. A new political paradigm may emerge based on PR, and they will no longer be the natural party of government, which is interesting that he's made this point about PR. PR would be great, but this article's a mess. He does not mention who these anti-EU institutions are. I'm guessing he's talking about the Bank of England and the IMF, but he won't name them for some reason. He's blaming the market, but at the end of the day, she spooked them. Liz Truss spooked the markets with bad policies and economic ideas that we know they don't work. She never set the foundation for the idea that you could do Thatcherism 2.0, especially since the market knew this wouldn't happen. And having a low debt to GDP ratio is good, but the problem is there are a lot of other things that are lacking in the UK. We are very, very vulnerable to the energy crisis, especially since I don't think we filled up our reserves, and we have less reserves than other G7 members. I think Italy's filled up their reserves. Germany have as well for the most part, which is not. It won't tide them through completely over the winter, but they can use those on days where the gas supply is low and use it to top up general supplies. And I think that Germany, because of the fact that they were very reliant on Russian gas and still are to an extent, they can persuade people to use less gas and be more efficient purely because these are temporary problems, whilst the UK has these problems pretty much most of the time. I guess with the energy crisis we are in a unique situation because of the prices, but in the winter we are really vulnerable to energy price spikes because we don't have reserves, and we're reliant on buying our gas from the EU or EU countries, which can say, the gas price today is ridiculously high because you're not part of the crew anymore, and we don't have to sell you stuff unless we're going to make a lot of money out of it. But anyways, especially with currency crisis. But I'm getting into the weeds here. Anyways, I want to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.